So let's look at our job as a comedian. All types of humor begin with some type of violation, and oftentimes we call it a comedic conflict. So what are some places that you can get this comedic conflict, or you can find these violations? So I'll give you a quick list here, and I'll give you an example of each one of these and how comedians can create comedic conflict this way. So the first type of violation is a violation of some kind of norm. A good example is a cultural norm. Another type of violation is linguistic. It has to do with the words that we're using. The most basic one of these is called the pun. Another type is physical threat. This is easy to see when your friend slips and falls, but they turn out to be okay. So there's this moment where you're stressed, but then there's this relief that follows right after it. Another common way that comedians can get this comedic conflict is through violating our predictions. And this is the basis of the 3-count joke formula, if you've ever heard of that, where you have this list, and the first 2 items on the list are normal things. They kind of set the pattern, but then the third one in some way breaks that pattern. So that's violating our predictions. We can also find violations in logic. This is something that just seems absurd. So these are just some of the ways that a violation can occur, but be very careful with it because you can also violate people's beliefs and values. And if you go too far in that violation, then it'll come back and bite you. And here's why. Comedic conflict doesn't just exist with a violation. It also requires some type of safe space. It can't be threatening in any way. If you look at a comedian like Louis Black or Sarah Silverman, then you can see that even though they are doing this shock humor a lot of the times, or they're using dirty language, there's still a lightheartedness about the way they're presenting their material. You know that they're not being serious when they're saying what they're saying. Sarah Silverman can get away with a lot of material that really pushes that boundary of what's acceptable. And the reason she can do it is because her personality on stage really creates this safe space for her to not be taken seriously whenever she's saying these things. So it's absolutely mandatory that early on in your set you create some kind of safe space where the audience knows that everything that's happening is going to be lighthearted. Even if you have this darkness into your humor, the audience needs to know that in no way is this psychologically or physically threatening. The second aspect of creating a safe space is what's called psychological distance. This is the amount of time between the present moment and some past event. A great example of this psychological distance comes from material that's done about 9/11. Shortly after September 11th, any kind of material or jokes about it would be way too threatening for anybody because it happened too soon. But as time goes on, you see more and more 9/11 jokes appearing because there is this psychological distance between 9/11 and now, which creates a safe space for you. The need for having a violation or some kind of comedic conflict in your material is why it's so important to have a very specific point of view whenever you're writing. If you sit there with a neutral point of view, if you look around the room, choose a random object, and just try to write about that object and try to be funny about it, it's going to be very difficult because you're coming from this neutral area. So if you look back and you see where is the comedic conflict, where is the violation? So if you're looking at an inanimate object, then it's very difficult for you to do that. So if you're having trouble pulling the humor out of your writing, then very often it's because you're lacking this point of view. The point of view is the main way that you go about creating this comedic tension. So we have 3 areas. On one side, we have the comedic tension. We have some kind of violation. This violation, if it stands by itself, is threatening. So we want to stay away from this far area. On the other side, we have this safe space. But here, there isn't any comedic tension. So if I told you a story about walking up the stairs and nothing crazy happens, then that's a really boring story. It's 100% safe, and so there's no interesting point of view. There's no tension. There's no violation. And because it doesn't have any of that, it's not going to be funny. There's too much of the mundane and not enough tension. So in the middle here, we have this combination between the violation, where we have comedic conflict, and we have the safety. This is the sweet spot for a comedian, because here you do have comedic conflict. There's a lot of fun places that you can go with it, but also the audience knows that they don't have to take you seriously. In this middle area, if you say a racist joke or a sexist joke, the audience knows that they don't have to take you seriously. And because there's nothing to be threatened about, they can laugh. So our number one job when we get on stage is not to jump out there and get a quick laugh. Our job is to find this sweet spot. It's to create a safe space where the audience trusts us, but also find an area where we have some comedic conflict that we can explore. So we have these three areas. We have the violation, we have safety, and we have the sweet spot in the middle. And here's a great way of illustrating how this works. Let's take the example of tickling. What would happen if you tried to tickle yourself? Because there's no violation there, there's no tension because you are doing it to yourself, you're going to be finding yourself all the way on the far right side where there's 100% safety. In the middle, you have this sweet spot where you're not 100% in control, but you are still in a safe space. In this example, maybe you're being tickled by a close friend. Now, if we go all the way over to the left, this is where you have a complete violation. So in this example, maybe the person tickling you is a really creepy guy. Since you're outside of your safe space, it's not going to be funny to you anymore. The only time that tickling is ever funny to you is when you're in that middle area.